So we have our two parameters. So we have x equals t squared minus 4. So I have to solve that for t. What would be my two steps? What do you think I'm going to do first to solve for t? Plug it in? Nope, not yet. We have to solve that parameter for t. I need to get this by itself. This is t. So the first thing I need to do is get rid of the minus 4. What's the opposite of subtracting 4? Adding 4. So I'm going to add the 4. So that'll give me x plus 4 equals t squared. And then to get rid of the square, I have to take the square root of both sides. Okay, so this is the part that is different. Normally, when we're talking about a function, we don't put the plus minus in front because we want it to be a function, which means it has to pass the vertical line test. But if we go back to really quickly the graphs we did Friday, notice that none of them are functions. So I want the whole graph. So that's why if you take a square root, you have to put the plus minus in front. So now we're going to take this and substitute it in for y right here. So my equation will be y equals plus or minus the square root of x plus 4 all over 2. That's my equation. I can't simplify that. There is nothing I can do. You cannot divide the square root by 2. That's all we can do. So now let's talk about the domain. We have a domain restriction here. There is a domain restriction. That means that our domain is not all real numbers. The domain restriction we have is a square root. Remember, square roots have to be greater than or equal to 0. So I have to take that x plus 4 that's under the square root, set that greater than or equal to 0 and solve it for x. So to solve it, I would just subtract the 4, right? So we get x is greater than or equal to negative 4. So what that means is on our number line, okay, starting at negative 4, that's as far as my graph can go to the left. It's a closed circle and over. Why do you think, let's go back to, why can I use a negative 4? If I put negative 4 plus 4, what number will I have under the square root? 0. Can you take the square root of 0? Yes, we can actually use 0. That's why it's greater than or equal to negative 4. So let's write our domain in interval notation, which would be, my domain would be bracket negative 4 to infinity. So this is my full equation and domain, and that's it. So we take x, we solve that one for t, we substitute that in for y, and then we look for a red light. There was 2 red lights I talked about first semester, a square root. Does anybody remember the second one? I know, that's going back to August. All right, let's keep moving. We'll get to the second one eventually. All right, so here, take your x equation, solve it for t. This one is a little easier. All we have to do is divide both sides by negative 3. And now my y equation, y says t squared plus 2. So I'm going to put that in the parentheses. This x over -3. Now this one can simplify. I can square x in -3. So x squared is just x squared. What's -3 squared? -3 times -3. 9. Would it be a +9 or a -9? Positive. Good. That's my equation. I'm done. Now, this one, we don't have any red lights. I don't have a square root, and I'm not dividing by x. That's the second red light. You cannot leave a variable in your denominator because you can't divide by 0. So basically, a restriction is when your calculator gives you an error. Your calculator will give you an error if you try to take the square root of a negative. It's going to say, no, you can't do that. And if you try to divide a number by 0, it's going to say, no, you can't do that. So this one doesn't have that. So our domain is all real numbers. Alrighty, so that's our second one. That's it. That's all there's to it, guys. Nothing crazy. That's my answer. Alrighty, let's look at B. Same thing. So we have x equals t squared minus 5. To solve for t, first I have to get rid of the -5, which means I have to add the 5. And then I take the square root. So I have plus or minus the square root of x plus 5 equals t. Because we want the whole graph. Normally, when we graph a square root graph looks like this, because I'm only graphing the positive, but we want the whole thing, which would also be this. So the inverse of a parabola or a square is a sideways, is a C. It's like a letter C. But we normally don't do the whole graph because it doesn't pass the function test. So now we're going to take this here and plug it in for t. So we have y equals 4. Make your parentheses and substitute that inside the parentheses. Can I distribute into a square root? No, we're done. That's all we can do. Do I have a red light? Do I have a square root or an x in the denominator? I do. So let's figure out our domain. Our domain is going to be x plus 5 has to be greater than or equal to 0. Go ahead and solve that for x. Which gives me x is greater than -5. And when I write this in interval notation, bracket -5 to infinity. That would be my domain. And that's that. What y'all think? What do you think the hard part is going to be for our day? Pretty straightforward. All right, let's look at C. Now C, this is the first time that I started with a restriction. Both of these parameters, they already have a restriction. This one has a t under the square root. And remember, you can't divide by, you cannot take the square root of a negative. If you take that t plus 4, which is great, it has to be greater than or equal to 0. That means t has to be greater than or equal to -4. So I already have a domain restriction. So this is going to come into play at the end. We just got to remember it. T plus 4 has to be greater than or equal to 0, which means t has to be greater than or equal to -4. Now, my y parameter is dividing by t, which means t cannot be 0. So far I have 2 restrictions. So far on my number line, if I were to graph this is before I even try to solve it. Okay, so -4 would be here and 0 is here. So far I have a closed circle going here, open circle here. I'm gonna add more to it, but right now that's what I have. Okay, let me pause because we got time. Like, we actually have time, which is like weird. Normally I'm like, oh my God, we gotta hurry, but we got time. Any questions about the domain so far? That's not my final domain. That's where I am right now. Okay, so now let's solve x for t. Let's start making our equation. X equals the square root of t plus 4. So the first thing I'm going to do, I have to square both sides. And then I also have to take the square root. No, I have to subtract the 4. I did that last period too. So this is what I get for t. That's my t parameter. After I solve it for x, after I solve the x parameter for t, that's what I get. Any questions about how we got there? So what am I going to do now with that? Where am I going to put it?
For y.
Yep.
Under the line.
Exactly. So my equation will be y equals 1 over x squared minus 4. Now notice that this is my final equation. This is my equation right here. This is it. It's final. But I want you to notice that I have a whole new problem now. Because now I have x squared minus 4 in my denominator. So we need to know that cannot be 0. So x squared minus 4, that can't be 0. So let's figure out what other numbers we're taking away from our domain. First thing I'm going to do is add 4. And then I'm going to take the square root. Now, when you take the square root of 4, it's not just positive 2. It's what else? Negative 2. So this one is a little complicated because we got a whole lot of things happening. So I'm going to go back to the little number line that I made. Hope y'all using pencil. Yes.
Did you square root the 4 too?
I did, yes. I square root both sides and got 2. Plus and minus 2. 2 answers. Okay, so now let's go to my number line up here. Now this is where I left off. But I have to add 2 more things to it. Now I have to add the -2 and the +2. Those are also excluded. So I have taken my domain and chopped it into 4 pieces. That is my full domain. So first we have to write this piece, and then we have to skip over to the next piece, which would be here, and then we go here, And then lastly, we end here. So let's write our domain. So my domain, I'm starting off with a bracket on the -4. Everything else is parentheses. So bracket on the -4 to -2, parentheses. That's the first piece. And then I have union -2 to 0. That's my second piece. And then what's my next piece? 0 to what? 2. And then my last piece, 2 to what? Infinity. That's a complicated domain. I'm pretty confident that we didn't give you one that complicated. That's a lot. That's like true pre-calc right there. That's a whole lot. All right, one last question and we are actually done for today. The last one is the doozy though, because we gotta add fractions and we don't really like fractions. Even though fractions are your friends. You don't like them. All right, so I'm already starting off with 2 red lights. I have a square root in the denominator. So that tells me automatically T has to be greater than 0. It can't equal 0 because it's in the denominator. And this one, T cannot be 0. So we already have these 2 restrictions. Right now, this is my domain. Open circle to the right. That's where I started off. And now we're going to see if we have to add more things. So let's take our x equation and solve it for t. And I will say I always solve this the same way every year, but one of my students in 5th period told me a different way, the way they thought. What are your ideas? Going back to everything you've learned, all the way to pre-algebra in middle school. How do you think I'm going to solve this for t? Any ideas? What'd you say? There you go. Multiply by the square root of t. That's the way I did it. That's going to eliminate the fraction. So then I have x times the square root of t equals 1, okay? We're getting somewhere. Remember, I'm still trying to get that by itself. All right, somebody else. What am I going to do now? Divide by x. That sounds good. So now I have the square root of t equals 1 over x. Okay, one last step. Square. Square both sides. So we get t equals, 1 squared is 1 and x squared is x squared. So that's my parameter that I'm going to substitute into my y equation. Alrighty. So now let's take that and substitute it in y, but I want you to notice, see how there's 2 different places where there's a t? We have to put that in both places. Okay, so it's going to be a complex fraction. So what I have is y equals, and it'll be 1 over x squared plus 1 all over 1 over x squared. Because we have to put it in 2 places. Okay. What do you have to have in order to add fractions? a common denominator. So what is my denominator? X squared. So I'm going to rewrite this as x squared over x squared. Would you agree that x squared divided by x squared is 1? You divide two things that are the same is 1. That includes variables. So I'm just going to rewrite that as x squared over x squared. So I have y equals 1 over x squared plus x squared over x squared. And that's divided by 1 over x squared. Now that I have a common denominator, I can write it as one fraction. So this is going to be 1 plus x squared over x squared. And we're dividing that by this. Almost finished, y'all. So what I did was, when you have a common denominator, you can make a single fraction. How do we divide fractions? Keep, change, flip. Let's do it. Keep, change, flip. Times x squared over 1. So what's going to cancel? X squared. They go away. So I'm left with just 1 plus x squared over 1. And you don't have to put a 1 if it's in your denominator. So my final equation is y equals, okay, this always turns off. Y equals 1 plus x squared. That was complicated. Now, in this equation, my final equation, do we have a square root? A square root. Do we have a square root here? No. Am I dividing by x? So I have any fractions with an x in the bottom? No. So I'm not adding any other restrictions. This is my final domain. My domain is 0, no bracket, to infinity. We cannot put a bracket because both of our parameters have a t in the denominator. So we can't divide it. And that would be your final answer. So Thursday, when I see you, we're going to finish out. I think you got about 4 word problems. I would recommend that you do what you can in the study guide.